What is going on YouTube? This is Acid Roots. So I'm going to review the 10th album by rap group Cypress Hill. Basically, this product is called Back in Black, and it came out in the late winter of 2022. So the thing about this particular product is this is the follow-up to Elephants on Acid from late 2018. It's a pretty good pitch. I reviewed that just a couple months ago. That was definitely a classic album. Had some excellent DJ Muggs productions on there as far as pitches like that kind of happened. Just an overall tour de force was them back on their vintage Cypress Hill type vibes, just in a more worldly and just kind of overall Travers type sense. That album definitely had some wanderlust, definitely a very emphatic smoke run as far as pitches like that kind of happened. Just very much psychedelic mastery as far as that particular pitch kind of went along with it. Definitely some blistering type stuff. But they kind of took a few years off. Now, the thing about Cypress Hill is they had been around since like 1990, 1991, pitches like that as far as that particular kind of goes. And this album kind of showcases that. It's a little bit more nostalgic compared to Back in or compared to Elephants on Acid was, but it's just kind of the concept. It's an interesting pitch because this is a pretty subpar album. I'm just going to go ahead and say the unfortunate thing, this is just 10 songs, which is too bad about that, but look after this is probably one of the worst Cypress Hill albums, not to say full blown, like to just dump on this particular product full blown as far as that particular kind of goes, but it just does not have that much highly to speak of. I think in a lot of senses for folks who have been rocking with Cypress Hill since way back in 1991, which would have been a good over 30 years ago from this particular point from 2022. And now it's 2024, so it's even further. But just the concept as far as saying for folks who probably were at the CD stores back in 1991 or 1993 picking up Black Sunday and Cypress Hill 91, some of those type pitches, just it's real nostalgic to kind of get that. But the unfortunate thing, kind of similar to how when I reviewed Limp Bizkit's most recent album from late 2021, it's just kind of the concept that the nostalgia factor outdoes like the concept of the quality of what they transformed into. There's some modernization of like the mood set and us overall appeals of this. Both Be Real and Sendog have a little bit more kind of just like upright and kind of more like upbeat kind of attitude towards things compared to how they were more back in the temples of Boom, Cypress Hill 4, Black Sunday type days. There's not as much of like the tone of like Insane in the Brain as far as that particular kind of goes, or Boom Biddy Bye Bye, some of those type ones I'd have to say. Obviously, with them kind of pushing 50 by this particular time or being in their 50s, Sendog and B-Roll were probably in their early 50s around this time in early 2022. Is just kind of the concept that, of course, with time, the maturation pitches like that would kind of happen. But I just look after it. It's the same thing with happens with Eminem and some other folks like this, Dr. Dre, even some of those type folks. The amalgamation of how this happened just makes you really reminisce for like old times. Now, I didn't notice this problem that the Elephants on Acid did not have this problem. It's a concept from Elephants on Acid to Cypress Hill in 1991. It was a different concept just because that was still a good 27 years that it had been since that particular point. And it's not like Be Real and Sendog were like 13 and 17 back in 1991. So they were easily in 2018, probably in their late 40s, just on top of that. But this album just has a different taste of like kind of more nostalgic kind of reminiscing, just within the sense of just kind of looking back and realizing that times have changed as far as that particular kind of goes. But unfortunate, the execution of pulling this off just doesn't work as well. And there's a lot of artists that have been really struggling with the bewilderment of time passing and not having the same effectualness from their prime days. I mean, it's some like I'm starting to question if this is going to be every single artist just looking upon more recent times. Like just really just a month and a half ago when I reviewed Elephants on Acid, I don't want to say I had full blown expectations because I've kind of realized that some projects past like about 2020 or so or 2021 is kind of the concept that some of these have kind of started to dim, but I didn't notice that as much with Elephants on Acid. And it's just kind of a disappointment that this album didn't fare better. I definitely feel like this is probably at the bottom of the barrel in terms of like all 10 of the Cypress Hill albums, including some of the ones like the 1996 like secret album that they dropped with like with like the extra songs on there. I forget what that album's called, but I reviewed that back in the summer of 2023. And then like Cypress X Rusco that I reviewed back in January this year was a pretty good classic as far as pitches like that kind of go. They just had a lot more bountiful kind of energy and just overall the approach. Like this Black Milk Cat who produces every single song on here, it's a decent approach to how some of this kind of happens, but they do try to bring back boom-bap, which is kind of unfortunate just because it's not so much that boom-bap is unfortunate, it's just the concept that a lot of these drum patterns on this particular album sound the same. It just sounds really ripped out of 1986 or 1991, the golden age of hip-hop, just mixed in with like some circa, not necessarily trap, but just kind of the concept of just something that feels a little bit more like contemporary, but the mixture of blending 80s rap music from like the golden era with like 2022 type sound just really didn't mix that well. And I just feel like the amalgamation behind it was just pretty poor on here, which is just kind of the unfortunate thing. The lead single is a decent bop, but the drum pattern on this particular one just doesn't really have like the execution as far as full blown. I mean, from a speaker standpoint and a sound system standpoint, it definitely slaps pretty hard. This is definitely one of Cypress Hill's wildest songs just in terms of the execution. They really translated extremely well to like the format of just like contemporary times, considering that not too many like Spotify years has Cypress Hill really been that much of like a real prize. Not to say that they're not quality music, but just the concept in terms of something that's for like folks past that grew up past about 2014. Cypress Hill has really only dropped like 2 albums since about 2014. So it's just kind of the concept of just saying when the Spotify years kind of popped up, they didn't really have that many songs, and it just really didn't feel like Elephants on Acid was really that sort of sound. But I can at least give credit, despite the fact that the sound's not going to get that high of a score, and I kind of feel like the production here is not that supremely excellent. I would still have to say that Bye Bye, the lead single, is at least, it's a sound system, real scaping type one, aspected type shrillness real aspected type shrillness that really goes along with it. But just the boom bap type patterning is just not, when you're not in like a whip where you're really smoking like crazy, or just someplace where there's going to be some heavy sound, or just like some socialized type moment. It's really not something for just more isolated type fare, or just standard, just housebound type stuff. I mean, you have to kind of be with like the outing as far as going along with it. If it's not something real litty in a situation, or just something to really have the effectualness, it's really kind of a dud of a song. That's just kind of the concept. But so yeah, I'll go ahead and talk about the single off this album. And then we'll get to the songs on here I recommend. So basically, like I was saying, the lead single is Bye Bye, and this has Dizzy Right on there from the Funk Volume days, which is a pretty good pitch, just because I feel like Demrick, who is also part of Exhibit and B Real's group, I forget what they were called, but they're like called Serial Killers or something like that. I think that's what it was. It's pretty dope that Demrick's on this particular product, but I think Dizzy Wright was affiliated with some of those folks, which is a pretty good pitch because he kind of faded into obscurity after Funk Volume fell apart. But this is a pretty good song. It's an almost song for me, but I still enjoy it more than a lot of other songs off this particular project. So it's kind of a distorted, kind of spacious whip smokage of a song. I definitely would have to say it's like a definite head trip I would feel about this song. But the boom bap mixture is very dicey about it, I'd have to say, in the speakers. But the speakers for this particular song, when you listen to this song, slap pretty hard. So it just really has like a gnarled and just overall effectual type one. It's like listening to a movie and surround sound at the movie theater, something like that. This is really going to knock the speakers off, blow out the subwoofers, pitches like that. I'd have to say it's a real good concept, kind of get some of that. Just kind of the concept that it keeps in like a boom bap kind of retro type format. So it's just kind of, I mean, I feel like this is very sonically pleasing in terms of the aspect of it, but just looking after it from like a standard fare, that if you're not smoking with your pals and have like some sort of aspect of just like as a sober song, this is not really much of like, if you're just trying to play PlayStation at the crib, something like that, or if you're just cooking a pizza, something like that, it doesn't really do much for the effectualness of it. It's kind of more of an out and about type song, or at least a decent, just kind of amongst the mixture. It's not really, I mean, it really doesn't work that much as like a nightclub song either. This is not really, this is basically pretty restricted to like vehicle bound, or just something where there's going to be something where there's like heavy speakers, and this where you're going to pick up the sound system, something you're going to hear this from a distance, something like that. This doesn't really work as much as like residential type fare. I mean, I guess in like a backyard party, something like that, something with like a lot of bass or speakers, something like that, but it just doesn't have like the isolation type feel towards it as far as like the effects of just something that would, like, if you're just kind of smoking with just like you and a bud, something like that doesn't have as much appeal, I'd have to suppose. But it's just kind of the concept. It's a decent song, but it's just kind of an almost song. It's just kind of the thing. I just feel like the boom bapness, it's just I realize that Cypress Hill has been around since like the early 90s, over 30 years as far as this pitch kind of happens, but I just look after it. It's a good song, but it's select towards it. That's the thing about a lot of this album, just to be able to say, I'll go ahead and recommend, there's 10 songs. It's a relatively brief album here, just to be able to say that in particular. And out of those 10 songs, I wound up recommending 3.5. So just a little bit over a third of the project. Those songs would basically be Come With Me, the original, Takeover, and the almost song is Bye Bye, the lead single. So basically, I'll talk about some of these. Come With Me is a Tupac sampling of like Machiavelli. I'd have to say they don't really sample Tupac, but they copy the chorus from like the song Hail Mary, which is a pretty good pitch. It's interesting because Cypress Hill really didn't mention Tupac that much back in the day when he was alive and they were around, but I did like the concept of it. It's like a wheezing, kind of hella smokish blur of a song, I definitely would have to say. It's like a claustral kind of head trip fun, I would say, about this particular song. It's like some vintage kind of Cypress. It's like a vintage kind of Cypress hit, I'd have to suppose. And it's like a full room. This song would be like a full room of smoke, I'd have to say. Real heavy smoke type session. Just really appreciate the PL of it. Just real nice one to kind of get here. So it's definitely a pretty good head trip of one. Vintage Cypress Hill as far as pitches like that kind of happen just with some of these smoking type songs. They don't have as full blown many, but it's definitely within the compactness of it. It's just typical Cypress Hill as far as that would kind of happen with some of that just blurry, not quite as much of a visceral kind of head trip like Elephants on Acid was, but it does have at least some decent ones to kind of say that you're going to get a little bit stoned and really kind of maybe have like a decent head trip about it. So it's kind of thing. The original is a pretty nice one. This is like a throwback kind of West Coast hot box to whip type times. I would have to say about this particular one. It's like a lackadaisical kind of nostalgic ruminating about this song in particular, but it is a pretty golden song, I'd have to say. So it's just kind of the concept. This is definitely one, takes it back to like 1993, 1995, some of those type pitches, smoking in the whip with your pals as far as that particular kind of goes. Be Real does have a YouTube channel where he used to just hotbox in the whip as far as particular that would kind of go. I forget what that was called, but it was like he had a series where he would do that. It's just a good concept, just really getting smoke hell throughout the whip as far as that particular kind of happens. Just real, the song is real lackadaisical and nostalgic. I just kind of feel like the concept, this is kind of one of those throwback type ones where you just reflect that, hey, 1991, what the hell, that sort of pitch as far as that would particularly kind of happen. It's kind of the concept of it. There definitely need to be way more songs like this on this particular album. I feel like Come With Me and the original, some of these smoking type Cypress Hill type songs really have the power of these particular ones. These are some strong moments just to be able to say. I feel like Bye Bye, if it wouldn't have been so boom bap ish, that probably would have been one of the best songs on here as far as pitches like that kind of happen. I mean, this obviously the smoking moments, just because Cypress Hill is always known for the smoking songs, really work pretty well. But we'll get to some of the complaints about this. But these moments were just definitely very fleeting, and there need to be way more. But another good hit on here is Takeover. This is a nice one. This is like a local round the neighborhood strolls of a song, I had to say. Just gas station type pickups, pitches like that. Just some good, get some swishers, some of that type there, get some zigzags. It's like a vintage kind of 90s Cypress Hill blast from the past type song, I'd have to say in particular. And this is just like a woozy update of that. This is another nostalgic type one to kind of get here. This reminds you of something that probably Be Real and Sendog were kind of up to back in 1991, 1993, just touring the streets of California, pitches like that. I just would have to suppose this real West Coast type flavor just really feels like something where you see the tennis shoes thrown over like the telephone poles as far as pitches like that. It's that sort of fair. Just hood is around the neighborhood type fair as far as that particular kind of happens. Just more like just whips with like the Dayton spokes, some of that type fair, just good sort of pitches as far as that particular kind of happens. Just some good concepts. I do appreciate some of that, but that's just kind of the concept. I did like the production of that particular one, just real West Coast type vibe. The thing about this particular album is it does have some West Coast, but not nearly as full blood. I mean, this is a lot more of like a Stark type album. Just to kind of talk about some of the complaints on here, I really feel like some of these type ones, like when I talk about this modernized type of, mentality, the last three songs in this particular album have a little bit more upright and just more sound type of like lyricism as far as that particular kind of goes. They're not quite as like slackerish and just overall just not as just kind of out of sorts and just kind of more not necessarily sleaze, but just the concept of being more rambunctious as far as that particular kind of goes. I feel like Break of Dawn, Champion Sound, and The Ride all have that particular concept. The Ride in particular, that did have a decent production on there. It also sampled like something from the Temples of Boom Days, Illusions, some of that type pitch, had a similar beat to like Boom Biddy Bye Bye, I'd have to say. Just didn't, I don't know, the concept behind it is some of these modernized type lyrics, the reflection of having a change of heart from the way that things were back in 93, 92. It just didn't pull off the vibes nearly as well as it needed to. I just look after the concept. I mean, for folks that have been rocking with Cypress Hill since the 90s, as far as that particular pitch kind of goes, it does have that effects, but it's just kind of seeing that in a different light, just the amalgamation behind that, it just makes you question if you shared the same beliefs as these folks 30 years ago, whether or not the change of heart is really as effectual. I kind of look after. But it's the same thing, the Champion Sound and like Break of Dawn were just kind of some ones that just, or more modernized pitches like that. Didn't really like the production fare of these type ones either. Just kind of more, they kind of felt like mixtape type fare and like an East Coast type sound, something that relative pitch. Just really didn't feel like Cypress Hill whatsoever. Not really good songs to smoke to or pitches like that. Just being able to say they just kind of felt like morning hustle type songs that just didn't really pull off the appeal. And it just makes me question why some of these productions were just not more polished. I look after it, it just would have been the concept to have had like something that could have had like a little bit less stark and a little bit less grainy and something. I feel like Cypress Hill is really aiming for like making an album that sounds like it's from 1987 or back in their golden years from like the late 80s, early 90s. But I just feel like the adaptation of it just didn't really approach that well. And there's a lot of folks that have kind of done it. I just look after it, but it's just kind of the concept. This was not that throw in a ride to kind of get that aspect of bringing back 1988 and trying to pit that in 2021, 2022. There are some moments that do it, but I just feel like the attempts at some of this was not quite as, executed and overall like amalgamated quite as well. Hit 'em was kind of a poor type one. This was a decent one for the whip, but I just kind of look after it. It kind of switches up the beat in like the second half of the song, a little bit more sparkly as far as pitches like that kind of goes. It's kind of one. It's a dazzling kind of car song as far as pitches like that kind of happens. Some decent kind of smoke is just to kind of watch the beat more as far as that particular kind of goes, but it just didn't really pull out the vibe nearly as well. This was not that real nailed as well. It wasn't as slick as like the song probably intended to be. It's just kind of the concept. This was not that dazzling, full blown. And then I feel like Open Your Mind and Certify were just kind of some thumpers that just didn't really have enough engaging type productions about them. I just feel like they probably should have packed like a second single on here just to have seen what could have happened with it. I definitely like the effects and the overall dazzling ability of like Bye Bye. I definitely feel like that's probably just in terms of like the sonically pleasingness, in terms of like a Spotify type song and like a streaming highlight. I would definitely say they needed more moments like that to kind of adapt to the times. I just kind of feel like this album tries to like adapt to like 2022, but keeping like the 80s mentality, but it just didn't really pull out the vibe very often. I just look after that concept, keeping like the thoughts of the 80s just with like a sound that at least brings like folks who are contemporary in 2022 and are young in 2022 to see what things are kind of like in the 80s. And it just kind of feels like more like a history lesson that just is not that interesting. I just look after the concepts of some of these. I mean, it has some of that decent thump, I would have to say, but it's not very much compelling to the point where I would want to purchase this album for those specific songs or listen to them very frequently. Most of this album is just meant to probably just download like a couple songs. I'd probably recommend if you do have some pals that are really looking for some knock and you really are a fan of Cypress Hill, but you want some recent Cypress Hill, I'd probably say Bye Bye is a nice one, especially if you're really going to smoke. If you're not going to smoke or if you're not vehicle centric, that song really doesn't have that much effect. So it's really not that much of a trip of a song unless you're having some social kind of jazzy times, but most of this album kind of lacks that Cypress Hill spark. I guess what I'd say. It doesn't really have thrilling moments of some like relative character. It has nostalgia down a little bit. Definitely, if you remember Cypress Hill and you remember them from the 90s, 2000s, early 2010s, pitches like that, it just has the nostalgia factor, but it doesn't really deliver on much else qualities apart from nostalgia, I'd have to say. So this is kind of the concept. Not too many replay value type songs to kind of get on here and say, well, this is a recent highlight from Cypress Hill. Like this is one to purchase the album for. This is a killer song. This is just one. It's a necessary one, and this is like a standout in their recent times. It doesn't really do that. So as a result, I'm going to score this album, me recommending 3.5 songs out of 10 on here. I'm going to give this album like a 3.25 out of 10. I feel like I would almost give it a little bit higher of a score, but I just really look after the fact, me just thinking of how many times I would return this album. It just doesn't really feel that frequent. I just look after the concept. I feel like if I'm not going to actively engage with these songs and I'm just listening to them with like the aspect of just saying maybe they'd be here and there, maybe some of these are maybe songs, like maybe listen to them like once every 15 times when they come up in a shuffle or something like that, or just the aspect of not very frequently. I just feel like that's not an album that I would rate like a 4 or anything above a 4 out of 10 or something like that. I really feel like in some cases it should almost get lower than a 3.25, but I at least feel like some of these songs are not horrible to the point where they just should never be listened to. It's just kind of concept. It's just not the most thrilling and overall attention grabbing the Cypress Hill product. Definitely the stuff. I mean, and just realize that Elephants on Acid from 2018 is a real classic. That's a 10 out of 10 album. Blistering appeal. It's a head trip of a project. This really eviscerates things. Real tour de force in terms of psychedelia and things like that, and smokage tunes. Is what I have to say. It's just this album really is like this album is like the complete bastard stepchild of that particular product. I just would have to say it does not have many redeeming qualities about it. So that's this kind of thing. So 3.25 score. The social score I'm probably going to give like a 1.752 out of 10 just because I feel like some of this just doesn't really have that spark. I mean, it has some nostalgic moments, I would have to say. If you do recognize Cypress Hill and you know enough of their hits to remember them to be able to say that, yeah, I remember Cypress Hill from the 90s, 95, 91, 98, 2001, some of those type pitches, any of those particular type times, just being able to say in particular, the memories on here do have some nostalgia factor, but there's just not a lot of moments that I feel like there's a couple smoking songs on here, But in terms of like sheer kind of killer highlights, or just like the ones that you want to purchase the album for, I'd say Bye Bye is kind of like a mild kind of Spotify highlight, just for like a real head trip to kind of say what's was something up in like a recent times. But even that song's not really that thrilling a song. It just kind of, I feel like the boom bap type appeal really holds it back in certain senses. I just kind of question why they just didn't go for something with a little bit more glitz and just overall feralness like they had on like the Cypress X Rusco EP from 2012. I'd say that was way that completely blows this project out of the water. I'd say just full blown. That's another head and shoulders 10 out of 10 project that just completely eviscerates this one. I'd have to say, yeah. I mean, this Cypress Hill with EDM just works far better. I'd say just needed something. I mean, this I definitely feel like Bye Bye knocks pretty hard, like I've said so many times. But I just look after it's not really a killer song that's full blown, kind of modest in terms of that. It's like it's a solid enough for social type fare, but for the most part, the replay value of just one particular song. There's nothing that has any else that sort of bass heaviness on this particular product, or just overall knock like that. And there's just not many of that returning type songs to kind of get some decent smoke moments if you need them. But it just I feel like the lackadaisical kind of more campy kind of approach to this particular album just kind of has the aspect where there's better Cypress Hill smoking songs. I mean, I just feel like some of these they're good. And I mean, they're good enough. Like "Come With Me" is decent, but it just kind of jacks Tupac somewhat. And the original is a decent type one for more nostalgic type fare. But I really feel like the theme of this particular product is not so much like, okay, we've got to smoke hella times like we always do. It's kind of the concept of reflecting, of like, hey, it's been a wild ride. Some of that type pitch. Just the emphasis of kind of noticing the difference as far as that kind of goes. But social score is not that high, so 1.75 out of 10 social. In terms of the future, like this is Cypress Hill's most recent album, and I reviewed every Cypress Hill product, so you can check out the Cypress Hill playlist as far as pitches like that kind of go. I reviewed them all. I reviewed like the uncut and unrated album from like 1996. That's a pretty quality project. I reviewed Cypress Hill's greatest hits from the Bong from 2005. That has some new stuff on there, some pictures like that. I'm eventually going to review Be Real Smoke and Mirrors project from 2009. I do want to get that one to completely cap off the Cypress Hill ride as far as that particular kind of goes. I've reviewed now every Cypress Hill album, so I would definitely recommend to check out the playlist. Definitely some excellent type stuff as far as that particular kind of goes. Plenty of classics in that mix. I feel like Cypress Hill Temples of Boom, Cypress Hill Black Sunday, Cypress Hill 4. I don't remember Skull and Bones as much, but that was relatively good from what I remembered 8, 9 years ago. Haven't listened to that one as much. Stone Raiders was decent. Till Death Do Us Part really has some gems on there. Elephants on Acid is definitely a classic. Cypress X Rusco is definitely a classic. So there's just some highlights just within their catalog. Most of their albums are probably over an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Even though I said Cypress Hill 1 from 1991 back in 2015 was like a 1 or a 2 out of 10, whatever I gave that is just kind of the concept. I just didn't have like the fleshed out type thoughts about it. But I definitely probably give that a relatively higher score. But I just would have to say, yeah, so that's the concept of it. It's kind of a dud of an album, full blown, I'd have to say, but it's just kind of haphazard in the appeal behind it. But if you do want to at least see some of that, just kind of for nostalgia's sake and some of that type of fare, it's not a horrid choice, but just realize that you're probably not going to be wowed that much.